decision to move to the new house felt like a dream come true. Nestled on the edge of a serene forest, with a sprawling backyard full of untapped potential, it promised peace and tranquility. Yet, from the very first day, the woods seemed to whisper a different story. The towering trees cast long, imposing shadows that danced eerily at dusk. No matter how often I told myself it was all in my head, an unshakable feeling of being watched settled over me every time I ventured near the tree line. Days passed, and though I avoided the woods, the unease lingered. It wasn't until I brought home Max, a rambunctious German Shepherd puppy, that I felt a bit more at ease. Max's playful nature brought life to the house, and I found comfort in his loyal companionship. He bounded through the backyard with joy, occasionally barking at squirrels or staring curiously into the trees, his ears perked and tail stiff. His presence helped me ignore the lingering fear of the woods. Until that night. It was late, just past midnight, and the house was silent, except for the occasional groan of the old floorboards. I had been dozing off on the couch when Max's sharp, insistent barking jolted me awake. His barks were not the playful kind I'd grown used to. They were frantic, urgent, almost panicked. Groggy, and assuming he needed to go outside, I stumbled to the back door and opened it. Max darted out immediately, his little body disappearing into the dark. "Max," I called, my voice tinged with irritation and a hint of worry. I grabbed a flashlight and slipped on my boots, following the sound of his barks. The beam of light wavered as I stepped cautiously into the woods, the chill of the night air biting against my skin. The deeper I ventured, the more the trees seemed to close in around me. The flashlight's glow illuminated narrow paths, strewn with dead leaves and twisted roots. Max's barking grew more distant, echoing strangely in the silence of the forest. The farther I walked, the more alien the woods felt. The familiar sounds of crickets and rustling leaves seemed to vanish, replaced by an oppressive, almost deafening stillness. My voice quivered as I continued to call for Max. A low growl in the distance made me freeze. It was guttural and unfamiliar, not like anything I'd heard before. My heart pounded as I shone the flashlight wildly around me, searching for Max. His barking had stopped, leaving me in a suffocating silence. And then I saw it. At first, it was just movement, something large shifting behind the trees, just beyond the flashlight's reach. My breath caught as I strained to see what it was. The figure stepped closer, and my knees nearly buckled. It wasn't an animal. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs too long and thin to belong to any creature I knew. Its face, or what I assumed was its face, was obscured by shadows, but its glowing eyes burned like coals, locking onto mine with an intensity that made me feel exposed, vulnerable. I stumbled backward, almost tripping over a root. The creature moved with an unnatural grace, closing the distance between us effortlessly. I couldn't scream, couldn't run. I was paralyzed by fear. But then, a sharp bark broke through the terror. Max. He appeared from the underbrush, standing between me and the figure, his tiny body trembling, but his growl unwavering. "Max, no," I whispered hoarsely, but he didn't move. The figure stopped, its gaze shifting to Max. For a moment, I thought it would grab him, but instead, it tilted its head, as if curious. Then, it let out a sound, a low, mournful wail that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The spell broke. I grabbed Max, clutching him to my chest as I bolted back toward the house. Branches tore at my clothes. Roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't dare look back. I could feel the creature's presence behind me, its eyes boring into my back, but I kept running. I felt some relief when I finally broke through the tree line and into my backyard, but didn't slow until I reached the house. I slammed the door behind me, locking it and collapsing onto the floor. Max whimpered in my arms, his small body pressed tightly against mine. For a long time, I just sat there, shaking, listening for any sign that it had followed us, but the woods were silent again. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window, staring at the dark silhouette of the forest, half expecting to see those glowing eyes peering back at me. But nothing came. Max stayed by my side, his usual energy subdued, as if he understood the danger we had faced. I never let Max out at night again. And though the woods remained a menacing presence in my life, I knew one thing for certain. Whatever was out there, it had let us go, for now. The sun was just dipping below the horizon when I tightened the straps on my backpack, feeling the ache of a full day's hike settle into my shoulders. I had spent the past 2 days wandering deeper and deeper into the wilderness than I ever had before, chasing that feeling of true solitude. My life back home was a constant grind. Emails, meetings, deadlines. But out here, everything was quiet, peaceful. This trip was my escape, and I had deliberately chosen a trail so remote it barely appeared on any maps. All day, I'd walked in silence, surrounded by the rustling of leaves, birdsong, and the occasional snap of a branch. But by the time dusk came, and I found a narrow clearing to set up camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that the silence had shifted. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy, as if something unseen was pressing down on me. I told myself I was just tired, but the unease settled deep into my chest. "It's nothing," I muttered, shaking it off as I unpacked my gear and got my campfire going. The woods were alive with the sounds of nightfall, crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, the whisper of wind through the trees. I prepared my dinner, trying to focus on the familiar rhythm of camping. But then, I heard it. It started as a faint tapping. Slow, deliberate, rhythmic. At first, I thought it might be a woodpecker, but it didn't sound quite right. The taps were too measured, too consistent. I froze, my spoon halfway to my mouth, straining to figure out where the sound was coming from. It seemed to echo from deeper in the woods, just to my left. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. A branch swaying in the breeze, or some small animal. But the feeling of unease grew stronger. My appetite disappeared. I shoved the rest of my dinner into the campfire and focused on tidying up, trying to keep busy. The tapping stopped, and I breathed a sigh of relief. But just as I started to relax, I heard something new. Footsteps. They were faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. The soft crunch of leaves underfoot, slow and deliberate. My heart began to race. "Hello?" I called out, my voice louder than I'd intended. The footsteps stopped, and the clearing fell silent again. I swung my flashlight around, the beam slicing through the dark. Trees, shadows, nothing else. I let out a nervous laugh, telling myself it was probably a deer or some other harmless animal. But as I turned back toward my tent, Movement flickered at the edge of my vision. I spun around so fast, I nearly tripped. The flashlight beam landed on a figure, half hidden behind the trees. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a strange shape created by the shadows. But then it moved. My breath caught in my throat. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too long and thin to belong to anything I'd ever seen. Its skin, or what looked like skin, was pale, almost translucent, glowing faintly in the moonlight. Its head tilted at an odd angle, as though it were studying me. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. It didn't even move. It just stood there, watching. The flashlight trembled in my hand, and I struggled to steady it. For a moment, I considered running, but my legs wouldn't obey. It wasn't until the figure shifted again, crouching low in an almost human-like motion, that I snapped out of it. I took a step back, and then another, my heart hammering in my chest, and then my flashlight flickered. "Not now," I whispered, smacking the side of it. The beam stabilized for a moment, but when it flickered again and finally went out, I was plunged into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to turn on its light. The dim glow was weak, but it was better than nothing. When I aimed it back at the trees, the figure was gone. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. Grabbing my pack, I stuffed everything into it as quickly as I could, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. The footsteps started again, circling the clearing. They weren't trying to be quiet anymore. My mind raced. Run into the woods at night? Stupid. Stay here? Even stupider. Finally, I decided to risk it. I decided to screw the tent. I threw my pack over my shoulders and bolted down the trail, my phone light bouncing wildly in the dark. Behind me, the footsteps followed. I didn't dare look back. I could hear it moving, fast, too fast, but it never got close enough for me to see it again. The noises weren't just footsteps anymore. They were accompanied by a low, guttural sound, like a growl mixed with something deeper, something I felt more than heard. And then there was the clicking, rapid, insect-like clicks that seemed to come from all around me. I tripped once, nearly face-planting into the dirt, but I caught myself and kept going. My lungs burned. My legs screamed in protest, but I didn't stop. Finally, I broke through the tree line and onto the gravel road where my car was parked. I didn't slow down until I was inside, slamming the doors and locking them. My fingers fumbled with the keys, but when the engine roared to life, I threw the car into gear and sped down the road, not stopping until I was miles away. It wasn't until I was sitting in a roadside diner, hours later, that I began to process what had happened. The thing hadn't chased me, not really. It had followed me, sure, but it never got close enough to touch me. It was almost curious. The way it tilted its head, the way it crouched. There was something almost inquisitive about it. I shuddered at the thought. Maybe it had been curious, or maybe it had been deciding whether or not I was worth the effort. I'll never know. One thing I do know: I'm never going back to those woods. It was supposed to be a simple overnight camping trip. I had planned it for weeks, mapping out the trail to a remote section of the forest where few people ventured. The kind of place where you could truly feel alone with nature. After a grueling few months at work, I needed the escape, a chance to unplug and clear my head. The trail was rugged and overgrown, the kind that felt almost forgotten. That was part of the appeal. I'd been hiking for most of the day, pushing farther and farther from civilization. By late afternoon, I found the perfect spot to set up camp. A small clearing nestled between towering pines, with a view of a stream winding its way through the forest. Everything felt still, serene. I unpacked my gear, pitched my tent, and started a small fire to ward off the chill as the sun dipped lower in the sky. It wasn't until twilight that I noticed how quiet the forest had become. The usual sounds of rustling leaves and chirping insects were gone, replaced by a silence so complete it felt unnatural. I tried to ignore it, brushing it off as the kind of eerie stillness that comes with being alone in the wilderness. But as the fire crackled softly and the stars began to peek through the canopy, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't truly alone. The first sound came just as I was settling in for the night. I was sitting by the fire, eating a simple meal, when I heard a faint rustling in the underbrush. It wasn't loud, coming from somewhere beyond the circle of light cast by the fire. I froze, straining to hear more. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. But the sound didn't match. It wasn't the quick, darting movement of a small creature or the heavy steps of a larger one. It was slow, purposeful. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it toward the sound. The beam illuminated only trees and shrubs, their shadows dancing eerily as I moved the light. "Hello?" I called out, more to reassure myself than anything else. No response. For a while, there was nothing but the crackle of the fire. I forced myself to relax, convincing myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But then it happened again. This time, it wasn't rustling. It was a sound I can only describe as breathing. It was faint, but distinct. A low, steady inhale and exhale, coming from the darkness just beyond the firelight. My blood ran cold as I realized it wasn't the kind of sound an animal would make. It was too controlled, too deliberate. I stood up, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline, and aimed it toward the sound. The beam wavered as my hands shook, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move, a shadow shifting between the trees. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice breaking. The only answer was the sound of my own breathing, ragged and shallow. I should have packed up and left right then, but I convinced myself I was overreacting. Maybe it was the wind, or an animal after all. I forced myself to sit back down by the fire, though my nerves were shot. It wasn't long before I heard it again. The breathing, louder this time. Closer. I grabbed the hatchet from my gear and held it tightly, my eyes darting between the shadows at the edge of the clearing. The firelight flickered, casting strange shapes that seemed to shift and writhe. And then I saw it. At first, it was just a shape. A tall, slender figure standing impossibly still among the trees. My flashlight beam landed on it, and I immediately wished it hadn't. It was unlike anything I had ever seen. It was humanoid, but wrong in every conceivable way. Its limbs were too long, its skin a sickly gray that seemed to shimmer faintly in the light. Its head was tilted to the side, as if it were studying me. But the worst part was its eyes. They glowed faintly, like dim embers, locking onto mine with an intensity that made me feel exposed, vulnerable. For what felt like an eternity, neither of us moved. It just stood there, watching me. Finally, I broke the stare, tearing my eyes away as I scrambled to my feet. I backed toward the tent, clutching the hatchet tightly. The figure didn't move, but I could feel its gaze following me. "Stay back," I shouted, though I knew how futile it was. My voice sounded small, swallowed by the vastness of the forest. It didn't react, didn't make a sound. Instead, it slowly tilted its head the other way, as if puzzled by my fear. That's when I realized it wasn't acting aggressive. It wasn't chasing me. It was curious, like it was trying to understand what I was, why I was there. The thought should have comforted me, but it didn't. There was something profoundly unsettling about being the subject of such scrutiny. I knew I couldn't stay. Moving as quickly as I could without turning my back on the figure, I just ran. I didn't grab my pack, the food, the tent. This thing could have all of it. Maybe it will be too busy rummaging through my stuff to chase me, I thought. I hoped. I began to retreat down the trail, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure didn't follow, not at first. It simply watched, its glowing eyes the last thing I saw as I turned and ran. But as I made my way down the narrow path, I started to hear it again. The rustling, the breathing. It was following me, staying just out of sight. I ran faster, not caring about the risks of tripping in the dark. My flashlight flickered, and for a horrifying moment, I was plunged into darkness. When the light came back on, I swore I saw the figure standing ahead of me, closer this time. I veered off the trail, crashing through the underbrush, desperate to put distance between us. The sounds followed, but they grew fainter as I ran. When I finally emerged from the forest and reached my car, I collapsed against the door, gasping for breath. The woods were silent again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. I didn't waste any time. I threw my pack into the car, started the engine, and drove away as fast as I could. Even now, I don't know what I encountered that night. Maybe it was just some trick of the mind, my fear turning shadows into monsters. Or maybe it was something else. Something curious about my presence in a place so rarely visited by humans. I'll never know for sure. All I know is that I won't be going back to find out.